Chapter 17. The first deputio, how this spring of love resembleth the uncertain glory of an April day, which now shows all the beauty of the sun, and by a cloud takes all away. By two gentlemen of Verona. One evening when the sun was setting, and he was sitting near his love, at the bottom of the orchard, far from all intruders, he meditated deeply. Will such sweet moments, he said to himself, last forever? His soul was engrossed in the difficulty of deciding on a calling. He lamented that great attack of unhappiness which comes at the end of childhood and spoils the first years of youth in those who are not rich. Ah, he exclaimed, was not Napoleon the heaven-sent savior for young Frenchmen? Who is to replace him? What will those unfortunate youths do without him, who, even though they are richer than I am, have only just the few crowns necessary to procure an education for themselves, but have not at the age of 20 enough money to buy a man and advance themselves in their career? Whatever one does, he added, with a deep sigh, this fatal memory will always prevent our being happy. He suddenly saw Madame d'Arrenal frown. She assumed a cold and disdainful air. She thought his way of looking at things typical of a servant. Brought up as she was with the idea that she was very rich, she took it for granted that Julien was so also. She loved him 1,000 times more than life and set no store by money. Julien was far from guessing these ideas, but that frown brought him back to earth. He had sufficient presence of mind to manipulate his phrases, and to give the noble lady who was sitting so near him on the grass seat to understand that the words he had just repeated had been heard by him during his journey to his friend the wood merchant. It was the logic of infidels. Well, have nothing to do with those people, said Madame d'Arrenal, still keeping a little of that icy air which had suddenly succeeded an expression of the warmest tenderness. This frown, or rather his remorse for his own imprudence, was the first check to the illusion which was transporting Julien. He said to himself, she is good and sweet, she has a great fancy for me, but she has been brought up in the enemy's camp. They must be particularly afraid of that class of men of spirit who, after a good education, have not enough money to take up a career. What would become of those nobles if we had an opportunity of fighting them with equal arms? Suppose me, for example, Mayor of Verrières, and as well-meaning and honest as M. d'Arrenal is at bottom. What short shrift I should make of the Vicaire, M. Vailnaud, and all their jobberies! How justice would triumph in Verrières! It is not their talents which would stop me. They are always fumbling about. That day Julien's happiness almost became permanent. Our hero lacked the power of daring to be sincere. He ought to have had the courage to have given battle, and on the spot. Madame d'Arrenal had been astonished by Julien's phrase, because the men in her circle kept on repeating that the return of Robespierre was essentially possible by reason of those overeducated young persons of the lower classes. Madame d'Arrenal's coldness lasted a longish time, and struck Julien as marked. The reason was that the fear that she had said something in some way or other disagreeable to him succeeded her annoyance for his own breach of taste. This unhappiness was vividly reflected in those features which looked so pure and so naive when she was happy and away from intruders. Julien no longer dared to surrender himself to his dreams. Growing calmer and less infatuated, he considered that it was imprudent to go and see Madame d'Arrenal in her room. It was better for her to come to him. If a servant noticed her going about the house, a dozen different excuses could explain it. But this arrangement had also its inconveniences. Julien had received from Fuchs some books, which he, as a theology student, would never have dared to ask for in a bookshop. He only dared to open them at night. He would often have found it much more convenient not to be interrupted by a visit, the very waiting for which had even on the evening before the little scene in the orchard completely destroyed his mood for reading. He had Madame d'Arrenal to thank for understanding books in quite a new way. He had dared to question her on a number of little things, the ignorance of which cuts quite short the intellectual progress of any young man born out of society, however much natural genius one may choose to ascribe to him. This education given through sheer love by a woman who was extremely ignorant was a piece of luck. Julien managed to get a clear insight into society, such as it is today. His mind was not bewildered by the narration of what it had been once, 2,000 years ago, or even 60 years ago, in the time of Voltaire and Louis XV. The scales fell from his eyes to his inexpressible joy, and he understood at last what was going on in Verrières. In the first place, there were the very complicated intrigues which had been woven for the last 2 years around the prefect of Besançon. They were backed up by letters from Paris, written by the cream of the aristocracy. The scheme was to make M. de Moirod, he was the most devout man in the district, the first and not the second deputy of the mayor of Verrières. He had for a competitor a very rich manufacturer whom it was essential to push back into the place of second deputy. Julien understood at last the innuendos which he had surprised, when the high society of the locality used to come and dine at M. de Rênal's. This privileged society was deeply concerned with the choice of a first deputy, while the rest of the town, and above all, the Liberals, did not even suspect its possibility. The factor which made the matter important was that, as everybody knows, the east side of the main street of Verrières has to be put more than 9 feet back since that street has become a royal route. Now if M. de Moirod, who had 3 houses liable to have their frontage put back, succeeded in becoming first deputy and consequently mayor in the event of M. de Rênal being elected to the chamber, he would shut his eyes, and it would be possible to make little imperceptible repairs in the houses, projecting onto the public road, as the result of which they would last 100 years. In spite of the great piety and proved integrity of M. de Moirod, everyone was certain that he would prove amenable, because he had a great many children. Among the houses liable to have their frontage put back, 9 belonged to the cream of Verrières society. In Julien's eyes this intrigue was much more important than the history of the Battle of Fontenoy, whose name he now came across for the first time in one of the books which Fouque had sent him. There had been many things which had astonished Julien since the time 5 years ago when he had started going to the cuirass in the evening. But discretion and humility of spirit being the primary qualities of a theological student, it had always been impossible for him to put questions. One day Madame de Rênal was giving an order to her husband's valet, who was Julien's enemy. "But, Madame, today is the last Friday in the month," the man answered in a rather strange manner. "Go," said Madame de Rênal. "Well," said Julien, "I suppose he's going to go to that corn shop which was once a church, and has recently been restored to religion. But what is he going to do there? That's one of the mysteries which I have never been able to fathom. It's a very literary institution, but a very curious one," answered Madame de Rênal. "Women are not admitted to it. All I know is that everybody uses the second person singular. This servant, for instance, will go and meet M. Vailnaud there, and the haughty prig will not be a bit offended at hearing himself addressed by Saint John in that familiar way, and will answer him in the same way. If you're keen on knowing what takes place, I will ask M. de Maugiron and M. Vailnaud for details. We pay 20 francs for each servant, to prevent their cutting our throats one fine day." Time flew. The memory of his mistress's charms distracted Julien from his black ambition. The necessity of refraining from mentioning gloomy or intellectual topics, since they both belonged to opposing parties, added, without his suspecting it, to the happiness which he owed her, and to the dominion which she acquired over him, on the occasions when the presence of the precocious children reduced them to speaking the language of cold reason. Julien, looking at her with eyes sparkling with love, would listen with complete docility to her explanations of the world as it is. Frequently, in the middle of an account of some cunning piece of jobbery, with reference to a road or a contract, Madame de Rênal's mind would suddenly wander to the very point of delirium. Julien found it necessary to scold her. She indulged when with him in the same intimate gestures which she used with her own children. The fact was that there were days when she deceived herself that she loved him like her own child. Had she not repeatedly to answer his naive questions about 1,000 simple things that a well-born child of 15 knows quite well? An instant afterwards, she would admire him like her master. His genius would even go so far as to frighten her. She thought she should see more clearly every day the future great man in this young abbé. She saw him pope. She saw him first minister like Richelieu. "Shall I live long enough to see you in your glory?" she said to Julien. "There is room for a great man. Church and state have need of one."